Good evening, my friends. It is August 30th, 2025. Here in New York, the heat of summer is fading, but the news still burns with unease. Economists speak of stagflation reappearing in a muted form growth, faltering while inflation refuses to yield. Consumer confidence has slipped once again, a quiet sign that households are preparing for leaner days. In Washington, debate sharpens. Should tariffs be raised to shield American industries, or will such walls only deepen the very problems they claim to cure? This argument, though dressed in modern suits and spoken in the language of global markets, is far from new. History is filled with moments when rulers reached for tariffs in times of fear. In the Roman Empire, duties on grain, wine, and cloth poured into the treasury, but also bred resentment among traders who found ways to smuggle and evade. In 13th century France, the Gabellan infamous salt tax became so hated that it fueled riots and later helped ignite the fury of the French Revolution. In England, Edward III imposed heavy wool duties in the 14th century to fund endless wars with France, binding the fortunes of merchants directly to the crown's ambitions. Across the Atlantic, the early United States found itself divided by tariffs almost from birth. The Tariff of 1828, remembered as the Tariff of Abominations, protected northern industry but punished southern planters, sparking the nullification crisis in South Carolina. The nation, less than 50 years old, stood on the edge of disunion over the price of imported cloth and iron. 3 decades later, tariffs again widened the gulf between North and South, feeding tensions that would explode into civil war. The 20th century carried the lesson further. In 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised U.S. duties on thousands of imports. What was meant as protection for American farmers and manufacturers provoked retaliation from trading partners. World trade collapsed by nearly 2/3, deepening the Great Depression and helping create the conditions for global conflict. The walls built for safety became prisons of despair. This pattern fear, answered with tariffs. Protection promised, but pain delivered, repeats across centuries. Yet nations, again and again, return to the same weapon, convinced that this time will be different. And now, in 2025, as Washington weighs new measures and rivals prepare countermoves, the echoes of those past battles grow louder. Tonight, we follow those echoes. From the tax stations of Rome to the gabelle of France, from the wool duties of medieval England to the tariff wars of a young America, and finally to the high walls of the 1930s. We will trace how old struggles over trade continue to shape the choices of our own age. These are not abstract debates. They are dramas of survival and ambition, of nations trying to hold their ground, and of people who discovered that every tariff stamped in law eventually reaches the kitchen table. So settle in, dear listener. Let the noise of the day fade, and travel with me into the shadows of history. And before we step onto the docks of Rome, where our story begins, take a moment to support this journey. Leave a like so more wanderers may find their way here. Subscribe so you will never miss the next story, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every gesture helps keep these echoes alive. Now, let us begin. In the long arc of history, Rome was never just a city. It was a marketplace of power, and tariffs were one of its oldest instruments. As early as the Republic, levies were placed on goods passing through the ports of Ostia, or across the bridges of the Tiber. Livy, in his vast chronicles, describes how magistrates used customs duties to fund wars against neighbors, turning trade into a steady stream of coin that filled the treasury. A sack of grain, an amphora of olive oil, a shipment of wine from Grisol carried hidden costs, paid not only in silver, but in resentment. For the governors of the provinces, tariffs were lifelines. Each frontier town or river crossing became a point of extraction, a place where soldiers stood beside scribes and weighed more than cargo, they weighed loyalty. Inscriptions from Asia Minor tell us of publicani, private contractors who collected customs on behalf of Rome. To the Senate, it was efficient. To merchants, it felt like legalized extortion. Smuggling flourished in the shadows of empire, just as surely as the Senate passed laws to tighten control. The more Rome taxed, the more merchants devised tricks, false compartments in ships, bribes for officials, forged weights and measures. The empire became not just a political structure, but a web of tolls and tariffs stretching from Britain to Egypt. Ordinary people bore the hidden price. Grain imported from Egypt, critical to feed the swelling population of the capital, arrived, already taxed. Bread, the staple of the Roman poor, rose in cost, forcing emperors from Augustus to Trajan to subsidize it with free distributions. The famous unknowna. What looked like generosity was often damage control. Leaders aware that unrest could boil over if tariffs and shortages pushed the people too far. Tacitus, with his cold eye for irony, remarked that emperors who paraded their largesse were often the same who had drained the people through hidden levies in the first place. Tariffs, in Rome, were not simply financial tools. They were weapons of control. When Julius Caesar crossed into Gaul, the question was not just conquest, but also taxation. Control of trade routes meant control of revenue, and control of revenue meant control of armies. The denarius stamped with Caesar's image circulated as a reminder of both power and debt. For every coin in circulation echoed the taxes that had made it possible. By the 1st century, tariffs had become so embedded in imperial life that they were taken for granted until crises struck. When drought or war disrupted supply lines, duties did not disappear. They remained heavy as chains, making shortages worse. In many ways, this ancient drama resonates with our present moment. In 2025, as Washington debates tariffs on steel, semiconductors, and agricultural goods, the logic sounds familiar. Protect local strength, ensure stability, project power. Yet the Roman example whispers caution. Tariffs filled the coffers of emperors, but they also encouraged corruption, punished consumers, and left the state perpetually on edge, afraid that unrest would erupt if prices rose too far. Rome endured for centuries, but always with this fragile balance, the treasury full, the people restless, and the merchants forever caught in between, as you imagine the docks of Ostia. At dusk, ships creaking under the weight of taxed cargo, merchants whispering of smuggling routes, officials tallying coin by torchlight. You can almost hear the same questions asked in Washington today. How much protection is too much? At what point does a tariff stop defending prosperity and begin suffocating it? Rome never found a final answer. It simply lived the cycle, again and again, until its empire itself began to fray. And so our journey begins here. In the empire that seemed eternal, yet bore within it the same tensions we feel now. What came after Rome's first tariffs was not stability, but escalation. As provinces groaned under levies, and governors squeezed every ounce of revenue, the system hardened into something darker. Trade war not between equals, but between center and periphery, a struggle that would echo in every age to come. As Rome's empire expanded, tariffs ceased to be the small tolls of a republic and grew into the arteries of imperial finance. Provinces far from the capital Asia, Africa, Hispania became the true engines of Rome's wealth, and every shipment of grain, oil, or metals carried not only value but also tax. Cicero, in his letters, often complained of governors who treated provinces as personal estates, squeezing traders and landowners alike. Customs duties became more than a matter of law. They became tools of exploitation. The stronger Rome grew, the heavier its grip on trade became. By the 1st century, provincial resentment had hardened into a quiet war of attrition. Merchants in Syria and Egypt, long accustomed to local levies, now faced Roman demands layered on top. Archaeological evidence from papyri and Oxyrhynchus shows detailed accounts of tariffs collected on simple goods, linen, fish, even pottery. To the imperial treasury, these entries were proof of order. To local traders, they were shackles that bound them to the whims of distant rulers. Some paid, others resisted by stealth, underreporting cargo, bribing officials, or rerouting trade through hidden ports. Occasionally resistance was no longer silent. In Judea, the discontent that fed into the Jewish revolt of 66 CE was not only religious and political but also economic. Josephus, in his account, noted the bitterness of people against the financial pressures imposed by Rome, tariffs, temple taxes redirected, and tribute payments combined into a burden too heavy to bear. What began as resentment at tax collectors grew into open defiance, and defiance spiraled into rebellion that would devastate Jerusalem. Rome responded with force, but the lesson lingered. Tariffs and duties, when pushed too far, could turn loyal subjects into bitter enemies. The empire's reliance on tariffs also exposed its weaknesses. During times of plenty, the system worked. Grain ships arrived in Ostia, duties flowed steadily, and emperors funded games, baths, and legions. But when supply faltered after poor harvests, piracy in the Mediterranean, or border wars, duties did not vanish. They became chains dragging the provinces down further. What was meant as a stabilizer revealed itself as a weight, pressing hardest in moments of crisis. In a way, Rome's cycle mirrors debates in America today. In 2025, industries argue for tariffs on foreign steel or semiconductors to secure jobs and prevent dependence on rivals. Politicians proclaim these measures as shields, yet history whispers that the shield can easily become a sword, cutting both ways. Just as Roman tariffs on provincial goods secured short-term revenue but fueled long-term hostility, modern tariffs risk inflating costs for consumers, straining allies, and provoking retaliation that undermines the very industries they sought to defend. Writers of antiquity often noticed the irony. Pliny the Younger described how wealthy senators grew richer from contracts to collect duties, while ordinary traders bore the brunt. Tacitus, ever skeptical, saw in tariffs another symptom of imperial decay, a government feeding on its own people, while pretending to guard their prosperity. It is difficult not to hear echoes of such observations when today's headlines report corporate profits rising, while household budgets shrink, as provincial resistance simmered. The Roman state doubled down. Soldiers were stationed at trade routes, river crossings, and harbors, not only to defend against enemies, but also to enforce taxation. Coins of the emperors, discovered in hoards across the empire, testify to the sheer scale of revenue extracted. Yet behind the silver and bronze lay stories of frustration, of farmers forced to sell at lower profit, of traders ruined by confiscations, of provinces seething under what was called order. Rome endured these tensions for centuries, but the cost was constant vigilance. The empire's reliance on tariffs tied its fate to the patience of its subjects, and patience is never endless. The longer duties weighed, the closer resentment edged toward rebellion, and rebellion, once sparked, often burned brighter than Rome could afford to extinguish. As we stand in 2025, with the US and its rivals testing each other through tariffs and restrictions, we might see a reflection of this ancient pattern. Tariffs buy time, they buy revenue, they buy the illusion of strength. But history suggests they also buy discontent, hidden at first, then suddenly revealed when conditions turn. Rome's escalation of tariffs did not end its empire in a single blow, but it helped corrode the trust that bound center to periphery, paving the way for decline. So picture again the province's ships docked in Alexandria, caravans halted in Antioch, merchants at the mercy of Roman scribes and soldiers. Each coin counted was a promise to Rome, but also a wound to those who paid it. From those wounds, unrest would grow, and the empire would learn that even the strongest walls of duty could not keep resentment contained forever. Wherever tariffs grow heavy, shadows soon lengthen, and Rome was no exception. The stricter the collectors became, the more inventive the merchants grew. Smuggling in the Roman world was not the work of desperate outlaws alone. It was often an open secret, woven into the fabric of daily commerce. Ships slipped into smaller harbors under cover of night, avoiding the watchful eyes of customs officers. Traders packed false compartments into amphorae of oil or wine, disguising valuable cargo beneath layers of cheaper goods. Even inscriptions unearthed along the Danube speak of fines levied against smugglers, proof that the practice was common enough to demand official notice. Corruption was never far behind. The publicani, those private contractors who leased the right to collect duties, operated with little restraint. Cicero's speeches against the abuses of provincial governors describe how collectors demanded bribes, seized goods unjustly, and enriched themselves while pretending to serve the Republic. Under the Empire, the system persisted, though cloaked. In bureaucracy, soldiers at checkpoints could be bribed to look the other way, and scribes might falsify records for a cut of the profit. Tacitus, in his bitter way, remarked that under Tiberius, the treasury grew fat not only from law, but from the silence it purchased. This corruption had an ironic effect. While Rome intended tariffs to steady its finances, the leak of bribes and smuggling often undercut the very revenue the state hoped to secure. Yet adaptation followed, for Rome was a master of endurance. Merchants formed networks to share risk. Cities like Alexandria and Antioch became hubs not only of legal trade, but also of hidden commerce, where goods could change hands before duties were assessed. Wealthy senators, invested in trade through proxies, quietly profited from both the official and the unofficial markets. The empire itself, while condemning smuggling in law, tolerated it in practice, recognizing that, without these shadow economies, the provinces might choke completely. The ordinary citizen, meanwhile, adapted in smaller ways. Families bought less, stretched supplies, or turned to local substitutes when imported goods became too dear. Just as in our own time, when tariffs raised the cost of everyday items, be it steel for construction or semiconductors for electronics, people adjusted their habits, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes creatively. Economic life did not stop. It bent and reshaped itself under the pressure. The comparison to our present is difficult to ignore. In 2025, with tariffs under discussion in Washington, industries weigh the costs of compliance against the temptations of loopholes. Corporations speak of supply chain adjustments, a polite phrase for rerouting goods through friendlier ports or shifting labels to dodge duties. Lobbyists push for exemptions that favor one group while quietly burdening another. And just as in Rome, corruption, though dressed in modern clothes, finds space to flourish wherever rules tighten. The tools change, but the instinct remains. When walls rise, people search for cracks. Ancient sources give us glimpses of this uneasy dance. Inscriptions from Asia Minor record petitions from merchants begging relief from excessive duties, citing the ruin it brought to honest trade. Coins discovered in provincial hoards show sudden shifts in circulation, suggesting goods were being diverted through alternate channels. Rome's economy, vast and diverse, learned to live with both law and subversion. Its official order mirrored by an unofficial shadow that kept goods flowing. Yet this adaptation carried a price. Smuggling and corruption eroded trust in the state. When officials were seen as partners in deceit rather than guardians of justice, loyalty to Rome weakened. The empire could command armies and collect coin, but it could not command respect from those who felt cheated by the very system meant to protect them. And once respect frayed, power itself became brittle. As we imagine the bustle of a Roman port, the smell of fish and grain, the clatter of carts on stone, the hiss of merchants. Bargaining in many tongues, we can almost sense the layers beneath the surface. Official scribes tally numbers for the emperor's treasury, while just beyond the torchlight, another exchange is taking place, unseen, unrecorded, but vital. The empire, like all great powers, survived not only on its laws, but also on the quiet compromises it made with human ingenuity. In this, the Roman story offers a mirror to our own age. Tariffs may be passed in the name of order, but life finds ways around them. Smuggling in antiquity and supply chain maneuvering today are not accidents. They are the natural responses of societies pressed by rules that promise protection, but often deliver only constraint. Rome endured by bending without breaking. Whether our own age can do the same remains an open question. For Rome, tariffs were never merely about trade, they were about empire. The revenues they generated did not simply line the coffers of local officials. They paid for legions on the Rhine roads that stitched provinces together, and the grand spectacles that kept citizens entertained in the Colosseum. In marble inscriptions found across the empire, emperors proudly recorded their largesse. Aqueducts built, temples restored, festivals financed. Behind the grandeur lay coin, and behind the coin lay duties collected from the daily flow of goods. The system was ingenious in its scale. Provincial ports like Alexandria in Egypt or Carthage in North Africa funneled grain toward Rome, each shipment taxed to enrich the state. Tariffs on luxury import silks from the East, spices from Arabia, precious stones from India were higher still, symbols of both wealth and control. To purchase pepper in the markets of Rome was to pay not only the merchant, but also the emperor. The empire's reach extended from the palaces of the elite down to the kitchens of ordinary families, all linked through the invisible thread of taxation. Yet the very strength of this system revealed its weakness. Duties bound the empire together financially, but strained it politically. Provinces bore the heaviest burdens, often seeing their wealth flow outward while their needs remained unmet. Inscriptions from Gaul complain of local treasuries drained for the sake of Roman projects. In Spain, miners extracted silver and copper, only to watch revenues vanish into imperial accounts. What was advertised as unity increasingly felt like extraction. The strain grew sharper as Rome stretched further. Emperors like Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius poured resources into frontier defenses, costs covered in part by customs duties. But those same frontiers often resented the taxes most, creating a paradox. The very people paying for Rome's armies sometimes harbored the deepest resentment toward them. By the 3rd century, as crises multiplied barbarian invasions, civil wars plagued the tariff system that once ensured stability began to corrode loyalty. Provinces asked why they should support a center that seemed unable to protect them in return. Writers of the time noticed the tension. Cassius Dio observed that the people of the provinces groaned under the weight of levies, their loyalty bought and sold with coin. Aurelius Victor, in his later summaries, traced the decline of Roman unity to financial pressures as much as to external threats. It was not only swords that fractured Rome, it was also the slow bleeding of trust through endless duties and tariffs. The comparison to our present moment is not difficult to draw. In 2025, the United States debates tariffs not only as economic tools, but as symbols of national strength. Duties on steel, technology, and agriculture are justified as measures to fund jobs, protect industries, and project independence. Yet allies and rivals alike feel the strain. Trading partners question the fairness of American policies, while at home, consumers quietly wonder why the price of groceries or electronics creeps upward. The stronger the center tries to hold, the more the periphery begins to question its share of the bargain. Rome managed its balance for centuries, but never without cost. The spectacles in the Colosseum may have dazzled, but behind them were provinces growing weary of paying for a glory they did not share. The aqueducts that brought water to Rome stood as marvels of engineering, but they were also monuments funded by duties drawn from distant lands. Every stone carried with it a story of extraction, a reminder that unity imposed through tariffs was unity strained at the edges, and yet Rome endured until the burdens grew heavier than loyalty could bear. The lesson lingers for us. Tariffs can fund armies, roads, and industries, but they can also deepen divides, turning unity into resentment. They bind nations together in coin, while quietly loosening the bonds of trust. Picture once more the grain ships docking at Ostend, their holds heavy with wheat from Egypt. Each sack represents not only sustenance, but also duty, a contribution to the empire's grandeur. The bread that will be distributed freely in Rome carries the weight of distant labor, distant sacrifice. In that bread lies both the strength and the fracture of empire. And in that fracture, history whispers a warning to any nation or modern that believes tariffs alone can secure unity. For centuries, Rome balanced on the edge of its own success. Tariffs filled the treasury, funded armies, and sustained the great machinery of empire. But every coin carried two faces, one of strength, one of strain. By the 3rd century CE, the cracks were plain to see. Provinces that once tolerated duties now chafed at their weight. Merchants who had bent under the system now resisted more openly. The very fabric of loyalty, woven by coin and force, began to unravel. The signs of unrest were not abstract. In Egypt, papyri record petitions from farmers protesting the endless levies that left them unable to survive. In Gaul, uprisings flared as local elites resented the drain of wealth toward Rome. The crisis was not only military or political, it was economic at its core. When emperors like Diocletian tried to stabilize the empire in the late 3rd century, they relied not only on stronger armies, but on stricter controls, fixing prices, enforcing duties, demanding obedience where patience had long since frayed. His famous edict on maximum prices, though aimed at curbing inflation, revealed just how deeply taxation and tariffs had gnawed at the empire's stability. Even the grain that once fed Rome became a source of tension. When supplies from Africa or Egypt faltered, the capital rioted. Bread was more than food. It was a measure of trust between rulers and ruled. To the crowd in the forum, it mattered little that tariffs had funded roads or temples. What mattered was the empty stomach and the rising price of flour. In those moments, tariffs ceased to be symbols of strength and became the spark of rage. Historians like Edward Gibbon, centuries later, would argue that Rome's decline was inevitable, the natural decay of empire. But if we look closely, we see that tariffs and duties played their own role in weakening the bonds of trust. They were not the sole cause of collapse, but they added weight to a burden already too heavy. They turned subjects into skeptics, allies into opportunists, and markets into minefields of resentment. The echoes reach into every age that followed. Medieval kings studied Roman practices, adopting tariffs to fill their treasuries and fund wars. Early modern monarchs, like Philip II of Spain, leaned heavily on customs to finance imperial ambitions, only to find themselves bankrupt when trade faltered. Even today, in 2025, the debates in Washington about tariffs on steel, semiconductors, or agricultural imports echo the same tension. Promises of protection at the center, hidden costs at the edges. Rome teaches us that the short-term coin collected may secure armies, but the long-term price can erode the very unity it seeks to defend. Imagine, then, the docks of Ostia once more. The sun has set, torches flicker, and ships from distant provinces unload their taxed cargo. Soldiers guard the process, scribes tally each emphora, and merchants mutter under their breath. The emperor sleeps in a palace funded by these levies. But in the streets, whispers of discontent grow louder. What looks like order tonight may become unrest tomorrow. That is the paradox of tariffs. The very tool of control can become the seed of rebellion. And as we sit here in 2025, watching our own leaders debate the balance between protection and openness, the lesson of Rome feels less like distant history and more like a mirror. Every tariff imposed carries not just a price, but a risk that the bonds holding a society together may be weaker than the rulers believed. So, dear listener, as you rest with this thought, remember that history's warnings often come softly, like echoes across the centuries. If you are still with me, still awake as this story unfolds, leave a 1 in the comments below. Your presence lets me know the echoes of the past are reaching you here in the present. When Rome finally gave way to the tides of time, the world that followed did not abandon tariffs, it reinvented them. In the Middle Ages, as kingdoms rose from the ruins of empire, customs duties became the lifeblood of monarchs who lacked the bureaucracies of modern states. Castles were not only fortresses, they were toll stations. Rivers and bridges, once markers of geography, became lines of revenue. Every merchant who crossed with wool, salt, or wine knew that the crown's men waited with outstretched hands. By the 13th century, tariffs had begun to harden into systems of mercantilism. Kings no longer saw duties as temporary levies, but as instruments of national policy. England under Edward I imposed customs on wool, the kingdom's most valuable export, turning the fleece of sheep into gold for the crown. Wool funded wars, castles, and administration. The chronicler Matthew Paris even lamented that England had become a kingdom sheared twice, once by its shepherds, and again by its king France. 2. Found in tariffs, both power and peril. The infamous gabelle, the salt tax, began in the 14th century, and became one of the most hated levies in European history. Salt was not a luxury. It was a necessity, essential for preserving food. By taxing it heavily, the monarchy guaranteed revenue, but also guaranteed resentment. Records show peasants smuggling salt across provincial borders, entire families risking punishment for the sake of survival. By the time of the French Revolution, the gabelle had become a symbol of oppression, proof that tariffs could provoke fury as easily as they provided stability. In the Italian city-states, the story took another turn. Venice, Genoa, and Florence built their power on trade, and tariffs became their weapon. Venetian records from the 15th century detailed duties imposed on spices arriving from the East, carefully calibrated to both enrich the Republic and undercut rivals. Merchants might grumble, but they also thrived under the protection of fleets funded by those very tariffs. Here was the paradox of the Middle Ages. Tariffs were at once chains and shields, barriers and bridges, depending on which side of the customs house one stood. The emergence of mercantilist theory in the early modern period gave tariffs a new intellectual justification. Thinkers like Thomas Mann in England argued that a nation's strength lay in hoarding. Bullion gold and silver and tariffs were the means to ensure that wealth stayed within. Exports were encouraged, imports discouraged, and foreign goods taxed to tilt the balance. The logic was simple, almost seductive. Protect your markets, enrich your crown, starve your rivals. The wars of the 17th century, from the Anglo-Dutch conflicts to Louis XIV's campaigns, were financed in part by this relentless pursuit of tariff-protected wealth. Yet history shows that this strategy carried consequences. Smuggling flourished in the Channel, pirates preyed on cargoes in the Mediterranean, and merchants developed elaborate networks to evade duties. The tighter kings clenched their grip, the more trade slipped through their fingers. The world was growing. Wider ships crossed oceans, new routes opened tariffs, once manageable within kingdoms, became entangled in the global flows of goods and empire. The resonance with our own time is striking. In 2025, as nations debate tariffs on technology, energy, and agriculture, the rhetoric echoes mercantilist logic. Protect domestic industry, limit reliance on rivals, and strengthen national power. But the lesson of the Middle Ages whispers caution. Tariffs can fund armies and build castles, but they can also sow resentment, drive smuggling, and ignite unrest. The gabelle was meant to secure the French crown. It ended up helping topple it. So imagine for a moment a medieval bridge across the Seine. A merchant's cart rattles forward, wheels groaning under barrels of wine. The king's officer halts him, demands payment, and writes the sum into his ledger. Beyond the bridge, the city waits with its hunger, its thirst, its markets. The coin handed over here will feed not only the treasury, but also the discontent that will one day echo into revolution. Tariffs in the medieval and early modern world were more than taxes. They were instruments of survival and ambition, of kings desperate to finance wars and merchants desperate to survive them. In their story, we glimpse the same dilemma that faces us now. Can a wall built for protection stand without one day becoming a wall that crumbles under its own weight? By the late Middle Ages, tariffs were no longer just a tool of revenue. They had become instruments of rivalry. Each kingdom, each city-state, eyed its neighbors not only on the battlefield, but also at the marketplace. Trade routes, once arteries of connection, turned into contested frontiers, where duties were imposed as much to wound rivals as to enrich oneself. England and France provide perhaps the clearest example. In the 14th century, as the 100 Years' War unfolded, tariffs on wool and wine became weapons in the conflict. English kings taxed exports of wool, the lifeblood of their economy, while French monarchs struck back with levies on imported cloth and confiscations of enemy goods. Chroniclers note how merchants suffered while kings filled war chests. For every battle fought at Crécy or Poitiers, there were countless smaller battles waged in markets, ports, and river crossings, as customs officers enforced the economic war. The Italian states, too, mastered the art of tariff rivalry. Venice, controlling the gateway to the east, imposed duties on spices and silks that passed through its harbors. Genoa and Florence sought to undercut Venetian dominance, forging alliances and imposing their own duties to lure trade away. Wars at sea, like the War of Chioggia in the late 14th century, were as much about customs revenue as they were about honor. Venetian records speak of galleys dispatched not only for combat, but to secure lucrative shipping lanes, ensuring that duties continued to flow into the Doge's treasury. Further north, the Hanseatic League, an alliance of trading cities stretching from Lubeck to Regeros, to power in part by controlling tariffs collectively. They imposed duties on outsiders, defended their privileges with fleets, and negotiated exemptions with kings. In many ways, the League functioned like a state built on customs revenue, its unity maintained through a common recognition that tariffs could be both shield and sword. But the League's dominance provoked resentment. Kings of Denmark and Sweden repeatedly clashed with the League, seeking to weaken its hold on Baltic trade. Behind each clash of fleets lay the simple question: who had the right to tax the flow of goods? These medieval and early modern rivalries carried a lesson that resonates into our present age. Tariffs, once justified as protection, often became provocations. Duties imposed to defend one economy were interpreted as aggression by another. In the 17th century, this dynamic matured into mercantilist wars. The Anglo-Dutch Wars, fought in the 1650s and 1660s, were not simply naval contests. They were tariff wars in action, each side seeking to control trade routes, exclude rivals, and enrich themselves through duties. Samuel Pepys, in his famous diary, remarked on the expense of these conflicts, noting how ordinary Londoners bore higher costs even as politicians celebrated victories at sea. And yet, kings and ministers returned to tariffs again and again, convinced they were essential to national survival. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, finance minister to Louis XIV of France, built an entire system of tariffs to protect French industry. He boasted that duties would keep gold within the kingdom and starve foreign competitors. For a time, France's economy flourished under his guidance. But the system also locked the country into endless economic skirmishes with England and the Dutch Republic. Tariffs did not prevent wars. They made them more likely. When we look at the 21st century, the parallel is difficult to ignore. In 2025, trade disputes between major powers play out in tariffs on steel, technology, and agriculture. Each side declares it is defending its people, but the measures are quickly seen by rivals as acts of aggression. Retaliation follows. Markets strain, and ordinary households feel the cost. The cycle is eerily familiar. A modern replay of medieval rivalries, where tariffs disguised as shields turned into sparks for conflict. Picture, if you will, a medieval port city on the eve of war. Ships lie at anchor, their holds filled with cloth, wine, and grain. Customs officers move through the docks, tallying duties, while soldiers prepare for battle at sea. The king proclaims that tariffs will secure the realm, but the merchants whisper of rising costs, dwindling markets, and enemies growing bolder. It is a scene both distant and familiar, reminding us that every tariff war begins not with cannons but with ledgers and coins. Thus, by the dawn of the early modern world, tariffs had become entangled with rivalry itself. They financed wars, provoked enemies, and defined alliances. Nations believed they were building walls of safety, yet often those walls became tinder for the very fires they feared. When European sails cut across the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope, tariffs followed close behind. The 16th and 17th centuries did not simply expand the world's horizons. They expanded the reach of customs houses and royal treasuries. Colonial empires were built not only on conquest, but also on duties levied upon the flow of silver, sugar, tobacco, and spice. Spain stood at the center of this new system. From the silver mines of Potosi in the Andes, mountains of bullion poured into Seville, each shipment taxed by the crown. The Quinto Real, the royal fifth, demanded 20% of all precious metals mined in the colonies. Customs officials in the Casa de Contratación ensured that nothing slipped untallied. The historian Fernand Braudel noted that Spain's empire lived on the edge of bankruptcy and abundance at once, a paradox born of tariffs and treasure. The revenue funded wars against France and the Netherlands, but the dependence on colonial duties made Spain vulnerable. When silver shipments faltered, attacked by pirates, lost to storms, or disrupted by rebellion, the royal treasury teetered, and the crown declared bankruptcy more than once in the 16th century. Portugal, though smaller, wielded tariffs with precision. In Lisbon, duties on spices from Goa and Malacca financed a fragile empire stretched across the seas. The pepper trade, taxed at each stage, made fortunes for the crown but also provoked rivals. The Dutch and English, resentful of Portuguese tariffs, challenged their monopoly, sparking a century of naval wars. The very tariffs that enriched Lisbon invited enemies to tear its empire apart. The Dutch Republic turned the game on its head. Masters of trade in the 17th century, the Dutch imposed their own tariffs, selectively, favoring their merchants and punishing rivals. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, acted almost like a state, levying duties at Batavia, Malacca, and the Cape. Merchants thrived under the shield of tariffs that secured their profits and under fleets funded by those profits. Yet even here, the cycle repeated. Rivals saw exclusion as aggression, The Anglo-Dutch Wars erupted in part over customs policies, with England seeking to break Dutch dominance through its Navigation Acts, a set of laws that imposed tariffs and restrictions on foreign ships entering English ports. Samuel Pepys observed in his diary how these policies stirred both pride and hardship, for while they promised English strength, they also raised costs for consumers. England's mercantilist ambitions grew sharper as the 17th century progressed. The Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660 required that colonial goods be carried on English ships and often sold first in English ports. Tariffs on colonial tobacco, sugar, and other staples ensured revenue for the crown and control for English merchants. But the acts also sowed discontent among the colonies. By the 18th century, resentment against customs duties would be one of the sparks that lit the American Revolution. In Boston Harbor, long before tea was thrown into the water, it was tariffs and duties that inflamed tempers. These colonial empires reveal the paradox of tariffs at global scale. They enriched crowns and companies in the short term, but made enemies abroad and resentment at home. Tariffs were shields for empires, but also the very triggers of wars that bled them dry. The silver that made Spain mighty also chained it to endless conflict. The spice duties that enriched Portugal lured Dutch and English fleets to seize their routes. The Navigation Acts that secured England's trade empire planted the seeds of rebellion across the Atlantic. And if we glance at our own century, the echo is sharp. In 2025, the United States debates tariffs on imported technology and agricultural products, declaring them necessary for national security. Rivals answer with their own measures. Supply chains reroute, costs rise, and whispers of retaliation grow louder. Just as Spain's quinto real bound its empire to silver, America's tariffs risk binding its economy to fragile expectations. That protection today will not provoke retaliation tomorrow. History suggests such hopes are rarely fulfilled. Picture for a moment the port of Seville in the late 16th century. Galleons from the New World unload their silver under the watch of armed guards. Customs officials weigh and stamp each bar. Scribes record the king's share, and the treasury swells with coin. Yet in the same moment, merchants mutter of bankruptcy. Soldiers complain of unpaid wages, and rivals at sea plot their next strike. This is the face of tariffs in the age of empires. Dazzling, powerful, but always fragile. The lesson that emerges is as stark as it is familiar. Tariffs can finance expansion and enforce dominance, but they also invite envy, resistance, and conflict. In the colonial age, they built empires, but they also lit the fuse of their decline by the 18th century. Tariffs and duties were no longer hidden mechanisms of royal finance. They had become lightning rods, visible to every merchant, farmer, and artisan. The resentment they stirred was not whispered in private, alone it erupted in revolution. Two great upheavals, one across the Atlantic in America, and another in the heart of Europe and France, remind us how tariffs and taxes, once pushed too far, can topple even the proudest of regimes. In the American colonies, discontent had been building for decades. The Navigation Acts of the 17th century, which bound colonial trade to English ships and ports, had long irritated merchants in Boston, New York, and Charleston, but the mid-18th century brought sharper grievances. The Sugar Act of 1764, imposing duties on molasses and rum, struck directly at the colonial economy. Worse still was the Stamp Act of 1765, a tariff-like duty on paper, legal documents, and newspapers, which touched every layer of society. The historian Edmund Morgan once remarked that what angered the colonists most was not the size of the duties, but the principle: taxation imposed without representation. From there, tension escalated. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea. Colonists responded with boycotts and protests, declaring that every tariff symbolized their subjugation. In 1773, when Parliament attempted to enforce the TI granting the East India Company monopoly privileges and imposing duties, the people of Boston staged an act of defiance that became legend. They boarded ships, dumped tea into the harbor, and announced to the world that they would no longer bear the burden of tariffs imposed from afar. What began as resentment over duties became the spark of revolution, the birth of a republic. Across the ocean in France, a different but related drama unfolded. The gabelle, the salt tax, first imposed in the 14th century, had by the 18th become a symbol of tyranny. Salt was essential for preserving food, and the heavy duties placed upon it were despised by peasants and merchants alike. Smuggling became rampant, with entire communities conspiring to move salt across provincial borders. Those caught faced imprisonment or worse, yet the practice never ceased. By the reign of Louis XVI, the gabelle and other indirect taxes represented not only economic pain, but also injustice, feeding the fury of a population ready to rise. When the Estates General convened in 1789, grievances against tariffs and duties filled the cahiers de doléances, the lists of complaints presented by the people. Demands for the abolition of the gabelle and the reform of trade restrictions echoed through the halls. And when revolution broke out, one of its earliest acts was to dismantle the hated system of indirect taxes. The National Assembly declared liberty not only in politics, but also in trade, seeking to end the chains that tariffs had placed upon the people. What unites the American and French experiences is the way tariffs transformed from financial tools into political symbols. In America, duties became the emblem of taxation without representation. In France, they stood for the crushing weight of monarchy upon the common people. In both cases, resentment grew until it spilled into revolt. Tariffs had promised stability for the state, but they delivered unrest that destroyed it. The resonance with our own time is striking. In 2025, as Washington considers tariffs on imports from rival powers, the justification is framed as protection for the people. Yet history reminds us that tariffs are not invisible. They are felt in the marketplace, at the dinner table, in the quiet calculations of families who find their budgets shrinking. And when burdens become symbols of injustice, they carry a political charge greater than any economic theory can contain. The revolutions of the 18th century testify that duties can inflame not just trade disputes, but entire societies. Imagine, then, the Boston harbor on that December night in 1773. The cold air bites, crates crash into the dark water, and men disguised as Mohawks shout as they cast the tea away. Each splash is more than protest, it is the sound of tariffs collapsing into rebellion. Or picture the French countryside in 1789, peasants gathering salt in defiance of royal law, declaring by their action that necessity outweighs decree. These moments remind us that tariffs, though counted in coin, can be measured in fury. And as we reflect in 2025, the lesson is clear. Duties imposed without balance, without justice, may enrich the treasury for a season, but they plant seeds of unrest that can alter history itself. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, tariffs did not fade. With the revolutions, they became weapons in new struggles. The world was shifting, monarchies falling, republics rising, and yet the old logic of economic walls endured. In the aftermath of the American and French revolutions, tariffs became both the scars of rebellion and the instruments of fresh wars. No figure illustrates this more than Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon inherited a France transformed. The revolution had swept away the gabelle and many hated indirect taxes, but the new regime quickly realized that survival required revenue. The Directory, and later Napoleon himself, restored tariffs not as symbols of tyranny, but as engines of state power. Duties on foreign goods protected fragile French industries, while customs offices along the Rhine and in northern Italy fed the armies that marched beneath Napoleon's banners. Every musket, every uniform, every ration carried with it the hidden price of levies gathered from trade. The true drama came with the continental system. Napoleon's audacious attempt to strangle Britain's economy. In 1806, after his victories at Austerlitz and Jena, he declared that no European port under his control could admit British goods. Tariffs were transformed into outright embargo, a wall intended to starve Britain of markets and force it to its knees. Across Europe, customs officials and soldiers enforced the decree, seizing contraband, fining smugglers, and punishing those who dared defy the ban. Yet history has a cruel sense of irony. The continental system hurt Britain, but it hurt Europe. More ports from Lisbon to Hamburg fell silent, merchants went bankrupt, and resentment simmered. Smuggling flourished on an astonishing scale. Along the coast of the Netherlands, entire villages survived by sneaking British cloth and colonial sugar across borders under cover of night. Russian nobles openly defied the system, preferring English manufactures to the promises of French control. By 1812, when Napoleon marched into Russia, the tariffs and embargoes that were meant to unify Europe under his rule had instead sown discord and disobedience. The empire built on levies began to fracture, just as Rome's provinces once had under their own burdens. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the young United States was testing its own tariff policies in the crucible of revolution and rivalry. The fledgling republic relied heavily on customs duties for revenue. Before the introduction of an income tax in the 20th century, tariffs were the government's main source of income. The Tariff of 1789, signed by George Washington, was intended both to raise funds and to protect American manufacturers. But as decades passed, these duties became divisive. By the early 19th century, Northern industrialists championed high tariffs, while Southern planters dependent on imports and exports denounced them as unfair. The seeds of sectional conflict were planted early, and like the gabelle in France or the embargoes of Napoleon, tariffs proved that economics could not be separated from politics. The lesson is unmistakable. Tariffs are not neutral instruments. They are deeply political, carrying within them the power to unify or to divide, to strengthen or to weaken. Napoleon sought to wield them as a sword against Britain, but found that the blow cut both ways. The United States embraced them as a tool of survival, but quickly discovered that what protects one region may punish another. If we look around us in 2025, the echo is clear. Modern leaders may not blockade ports with soldiers, but they impose tariffs with the same ambition: to protect, to pressure, to prevail. Yet the risks remain the same. Just as the continental system provoked smuggling and resentment, today's tariffs drive supply chains underground, spark retaliation, and erode alliances. History's stage may have changed, but the script is eerily familiar. So, as you imagine the crowded ports of Europe under Napoleon's soldiers patrolling docks, merchants grumbling in shuttered warehouses, smugglers slipping cargo into the night stream, remember that every tariff is more than a line in law. It is a gamble, a test of loyalty, a spark that can ignite consequences far beyond what rulers intend. And if you are still with me, still awake as these echoes of revolutions and wars drift across the centuries into our present day, leave a 1 in the comments below. Your presence tells me that the story of tariffs, old battles on new fronts, still finds a listener tonight. When the United States won its independence in 1783, it inherited not only freedom but also debt. The young republic had fought a costly war, its finances in tatters, its credit fragile in the eyes of Europe. With no established system of internal taxation, Congress turned to the oldest tool of states, tariffs. In 1789, in the very first session after the ratification of the Constitution, lawmakers passed the Tariff Act of July 4th. George Washington signed it into law, making customs duties the backbone of federal revenue. The tariff of 1789 was modest. Compared to later standards, rates averaged around 8 to 12%, but its significance was immense. It signaled that the federal government had the authority to collect revenue directly, unifying the states under one economic policy. The duties were levied on imports of manufactured goods, textiles, and luxury items, sparing most raw materials. To encourage trade, Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Treasury Secretary, defended the policy in his famous report on manufactures, arguing that protective duties would nurture American industry until it could compete with Europe. Not everyone agreed. The South, with its plantation economy dependent on imports and exports, bristled at the idea of tariffs. Southern planters saw them as a hidden tax that made manufactured goods more expensive, while benefiting northern factories. Even at this early stage, the seeds of sectional division were visible. James Madison himself, once Hamilton's ally, expressed unease at the growing tension, warning that duties should not favor one region at the expense of another. Still, the system held, and for decades, tariffs remained the chief source of revenue for the federal government. Customs houses sprouted in ports from Boston to Charleston, their clerks tallying the cargoes of ships and collecting the coin that kept the Republic afloat. Travelers of the era described the bustle of New York's harbor, ships arriving from Liverpool or Bordeaux, inspectors boarding with ledgers in hand, merchants calculating how much profit would remain after duties were paid. For a young nation, still unsure of its place in the world, tariffs offered both stability and sovereignty. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The very mechanism that paid the debts of the Republic also threatened to fracture it. Southern leaders grumbled that their region bore disproportionate costs, while Northern politicians insisted that without tariffs, American industry would wither in the face of European competition. The debate was not just about economics. It was about identity, about whose vision of America would prevail. This tension is not so distant from our present moment. In 2025, the United States again debates tariffs as a tool of protection. The rhetoric echoes Hamilton's: shield domestic industries, nurture national strength, and assert independence from rivals. Yet the anxieties also echo those of the early South: fear of rising costs, fear of regional disparity, fear that tariffs enrich one sector while impoverishing another. History, it seems, offers not a distant mirror, but a living one. The Tariff of 1789 was celebrated as a triumph of unity, but it also marked the beginning of a long and often bitter struggle over the role of tariffs in American life. For the next half-century, the Republic would wrestle with questions that never seemed fully answered. Should tariffs be low and purely for revenue, or high and protective of industry? Should they favor one region over another, or balance interests across the nation? Each answer carried consequences that reached far beyond coin and cargo. Imagine standing in the port of Philadelphia in 1790. The air smells of tar and salt. Sailors shout as crates are hauled ashore, and officials in plain coats record every item: cloth, glassware, rum, tools. Each entry is more than commerce. It is the lifeblood of a nation struggling to find its footing. And behind each coin collected lies a question that would haunt America for generations. Could tariffs hold the Republic together, or would they one day pull it apart? By the 1820s, the United States had grown beyond its fragile beginnings. Cotton poured out of the South, factories multiplied in the North, and westward expansion stirred dreams of prosperity. Yet beneath the optimism, the question of tariffs smoldered. For decades, customs duties had been the chief source of federal revenue. But now, they became the centerpiece of a deeper conflict. Should tariffs serve merely to fund government, or should they protect American industry by raising barriers against foreign goods? In 1828, Congress passed what history remembers as the Tariff of Abominations. Rates soared to nearly 45% on many manufactured imports, including wool, iron, and textiles. Northern industrialists, especially in New England and Pennsylvania, rejoiced, believing their factories would thrive under such protection. But in the South, the reaction was furious. Planters who exported cotton and relied on imported goods saw the tariff as a direct assault on their livelihoods. Why should they pay more for British cloth or machinery simply to enrich northern manufacturers? South Carolina took the lead in opposition. Led by John C. Calhoun, the state argued that the tariff was unconstitutional, benefiting one section of the country at the expense of another. In his anonymous South Carolina exposition and protest, Calhoun laid out the doctrine of nullification, the claim that a state had the right to nullify, or refuse to enforce, any federal law it deemed unjust. The debate was no longer merely about economics. It struck at the heart of the Union itself. The crisis escalated in 1832, when Congress passed a revised tariff that lowered some rates but left others high. South Carolina declared the tariffs null and void within its borders, raising the specter of disunion. President Andrew Jackson, though a Southerner himself, responded with uncompromising force. In a proclamation to the people of South Carolina, he denounced nullification as treason and warned that the Union must be preserved. At the same time, Congress passed a force bill, authorizing Jackson to use military power if necessary. To enforce the law, war seemed possible, yet compromise prevailed. In 1833, Henry Clay brokered a Delta Compromise tariff which gradually reduced duties over the next decade. South Carolina rescinded its nullification, though defiantly, nullifying the force bill in symbolic protest. The Union was saved, but the scars remained. The nullification crisis had revealed how tariffs, meant to serve as instruments of economic policy, could ignite political fires that threatened the nation's very existence. Historians like Daniel Walker Howe have argued that the Tariff of Abominations was not simply about rates and revenue. It was about competing visions of America. The North saw a future of factories and industry, protected by high tariffs. The South saw a future of agriculture and trade, threatened by those same barriers. The tariff became a symbol of sectional identity, a foretaste of the divisions that would culminate in the Civil War. The resonance with today is striking. In 2025, debates over tariffs often carry similar undertones. Advocates frame them as necessary to protect domestic industries, semiconductors, steel, green technology. Opponents warn that they raise costs, distort markets, and provoke retaliation. Just as in 1828, tariffs are not neutral. They carry the weight of political identity, regional interest, and national destiny. When one region feels sacrificed for another, the unity of the whole is tested. Picture the South Carolina legislature in 1832. Men gathered in heated debate, voices echoing in wooden chambers, declaring their right to defy the federal government. Outside, planters fume over rising prices, while in northern factories, looms clatter in triumph. The tariff that was meant to protect prosperity had become a wedge driven into the heart of the Union. And so, the Tariff of Abominations reminds us that economic tools can become political weapons. They may raise revenue, protect industries, or project power. But they can also stir resentment strong enough to challenge the bonds of nationhood. The Compromise of 1833 cooled the flames of nullification, but it did not extinguish the fire beneath. Tariffs remained the uneasy fault line running through the Republic, a reminder that the United States was less a single nation than a fragile union of competing regions. Each decade that passed drew the line deeper, and by the Century tariffs had become inseparable from the great crisis of slavery and disunion. For the North, tariffs were lifeblood. Industry grew rapidly in cities like Lowell, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. Railroads expanded, ironworks flourished, and textile mills churned. Protectionist policies kept British goods at bay, allowing American factories to thrive. Speeches in Congress by men such as Henry Clay framed tariffs as part of the American system, a vision of national prosperity built on internal improvements, industry, and strong government support. To Northern manufacturers and workers, high tariffs meant jobs, wages, and independence from foreign dominance. For the South, the picture was starkly different. The plantation economy relied on cotton exports, nearly all of which went overseas, and on imported, manufactured goods. High tariffs raised the price of everything from clothing to farming tools, while providing little benefit in return. Southern leaders saw themselves as paying for Northern prosperity. Newspapers in Charleston and Richmond railed against economic tyranny, warning that the Union was becoming a bargain weighted against them. John C. Calhoun's doctrine of nullification never truly died. It lingered in every Southern grievance against federal policy. The 1840s and 1850s only deepened the divide. The Walker Tariff of 1846, lowering rates, pleased the South for a time. But protectionist forces soon reasserted themselves. The Morrill Tariff of 1861, passed just before Abraham Lincoln took office, raised duties sharply once more. To Southerners already contemplating secession, it was proof that the federal government was irretrievably biased toward Northern interests. Historian Charles Beard later argued that the Civil War was as much a conflict of economic systems as of morality, with tariffs symbolizing the clash of industrial North and agrarian South. The outbreak of war in 1861 seemed to confirm the prophecy of decades past that tariffs, while not the sole cause, had been one of the wedges that split the nation. The Confederacy, formed in defiance of federal authority, immediately wrote low tariffs into its constitution, declaring its faith in free trade. The Union, by contrast, relied on high duties to finance the war effort. With customs revenue paying for guns, uniforms, and ironclads, tariffs that had once divided the nation now helped to fund the struggle that determined its survival. It is tempting, perhaps, to dismiss these conflicts as relics of a bygone age, but the echoes are unmistakable. In 2025, as Washington debates tariffs on technology and agricultural imports, the same question surfaces: who benefits and who pays? Just as the North once celebrated protection while the South cursed it as oppression, today's industries and regions experience tariffs unevenly. Silicon Valley may welcome duties that shelter its innovations, while Midwestern farmers groan at retaliatory measures that close off foreign markets. The pattern remains one nation, divided by the costs and benefits of walls built in the name of strength. Imagine, for a moment, the halls of Congress in the 1850s. Northern senators speak with urgency of protecting factories and workers. There, words echoing with confidence in progress. Across the chamber, Southern delegates sit in grim silence, their patience fraying. Outside, newspapers shout of injustice, and ordinary citizens feel the strain each time they pay more for daily goods. In such an atmosphere, tariffs ceased to be economic policy. They became symbols of betrayal, of sectional identity, of loyalty or defiance. By the time cannons roared at Fort Sumter, the argument had moved beyond duties and imports. Yet the long history of tariff disputes had carved the nation into two economic visions, each convinced it could not live under the other's rules. The road to war was paved not only with speeches on slavery and state rights, but also with decades of resentment over customs duties and economic imbalance. And so, the story of tariffs in antebellum America reminds us that walls of protection however well-intentioned, can also become walls of division. They may shield industries, but they can fracture nations. When the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the clash was about far more than customs duties. Yet the irony remains. Tariffs, those dry lines of legislation, had long been one of the threads unraveling the Union. Now, in war, they became lifelines. For the Union, tariffs were not only policy, they were survival. One of the earliest acts of the Republican-controlled Congress after secession was to pass the Memorial Tariff, signed into law by President James Buchanan just before Lincoln took office. This measure sharply raised duties on imports, reversing the moderate rates of the 1846 Walker Tariff. With the South gone, there was little opposition. Northern industrialists cheered. Factories in Pennsylvania and New England gained immediate protection. But beyond protection, the tariff had a more urgent purpose: revenue. With the federal government suddenly cut off from southern customs houses like Charleston and New Orleans, it needed to secure funds to wage war. Customs revenue became a critical pillar of Union finance. Alongside the issuance of greenbacks and the first federal income tax in 1861, tariffs filled the treasury to pay for muskets, uniforms, ironclad ships, and the massive logistical effort required to sustain armies of unprecedented size. Ports, such as New York, became hubs of wartime finance. Customs houses buzzing with activity as officials calculated duties on ships arriving from Britain, France, and beyond. Visitors to the Grand Customs House on Wall Street in the 1860s remarked at the endless line of merchants, each contributing coin to the Union's cause. For the Confederacy, the story was far darker. The Confederate Constitution enshrined low tariffs, reflecting Southern faith in free trade. Leaders hoped to attract European support by offering cheap access to cotton. But this strategy quickly faltered. The Union blockade cut off Southern ports. Smuggling routes could not make up the loss, and foreign powers hesitated to openly defy. The blockade, without customs revenue, and without robust taxation at home, the Confederacy turned increasingly to printing money, fueling inflation so severe that by 1864, Confederate notes were nearly worthless. Thus, a policy born of ideology, the rejection of tariffs contributed to the financial collapse of the Southern cause. After the war, tariffs remained high. The Republican Party, triumphant, continued to see them as both protection and revenue. During Reconstruction, industries in the North thrived under protective walls, while the devastated South struggled to adapt. Duties on iron, textiles, and manufactured goods kept European competition at bay, but they also kept prices higher for consumers nationwide. Yet with the South politically weakened, opposition carried little weight. For nearly half a century, high tariffs would dominate American policy, shaping the industrial boom of the Gilded Age. Historians like Eric Foner have noted that tariffs in the Civil War era symbolized more than finance. They embodied the divergent identities of North and South. One side believed prosperity came through protection and state power. The other clung to free trade and agricultural independence. The war settled the question militarily, but economically the North's vision prevailed. Tariffs became entrenched, not only as fiscal policy, but as ideology, a badge of victory for industry and the federal state. And yet, even in victory, the same risks lingered. High duties bred resentment among farmers and consumers who paid more for goods. Political debates in the late 19th century would circle again and again around the tariff question, splitting parties and shaping elections. What had been a weapon of war became a point of contention in peace. The echo to our own time is hard to ignore. In 2025, debates rage over tariffs on steel, semiconductors, and green technologies. Advocates speak of protection and independence, much as union leaders once did. Opponents warn of rising prices, much as Southern planters once complained. The stakes may differ, but the dynamic feels familiar. Tariffs as instruments of strength, but also as sparks of division. Imagine, for a moment, New York Harbor in 1863. Ships unload crates of cloth and steel. Customs officials record duties with stern precision, and every coin collected is destined to feed the Union war machine. In the South, ports lie silent under blockade, warehouses empty, currency fluttering toward worthlessness. Two visions of trade, two visions of tariffs, and two destinies unfolding. The war was fought with rifles and cannon, but it was financed with ledgers and coin. Each tariff a small contribution to the preservation of the Union, and so, the Civil War and Reconstruction remind us that tariffs are never neutral. They can preserve a nation or undermine it, depending on the hands that wield them and the trust of the people who pay them. With the smoke of the Civil War cleared and Reconstruction slowly fading, the United States entered an era of rapid industrial growth. Railroads stretched across the continent, factories multiplied, and cities swelled with workers. But behind the clang of steel and the roar of engines lay a question that refused to die. What role should tariffs play in this new America? For the Republican Party, dominant in the post-war decades, the answer was simple: tariffs should remain high. They were the cornerstone of what politicians proudly called the American system. Duties on imported steel, textiles, and machinery protected domestic industries, allowing entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller to flourish. Protective walls kept European competitors at bay, giving rise to the titans of the Gilded Age. The numbers tell the story. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 raised average duties to nearly 50%, among the highest in American history. Advocates argued that these rates secured American jobs and wages, ensuring that the nation would not become dependent on foreign manufacturers. Republican campaign slogans rang with confidence: protection, not free trade. Too many in the booming industrial North. The tariff seemed not only sound policy, but national destiny. Yet across the country, discontent simmered. Farmers in the South and West, already squeezed by falling crop prices and railroad monopolies, felt betrayed. Higher tariffs meant higher prices for manufactured goods, from plows to clothing, while their own agricultural exports faced retaliation in foreign markets. The populist movement, rising in the 1880s and 1890s, denounced tariffs as instruments of corporate greed. In speeches across the plains, farmers declared that the government had become a servant of industrial barons, taxing the many to enrich the few. Political battles over tariffs dominated national elections. The contest between Republican Benjamin Harrison and Democrat Grover Cleveland in 1888 turned almost entirely on the tariff question. Harrison, promising protection, won the White House with strong support from industrial states. Cleveland, who favored lower tariffs, returned in 1892 after public backlash against the McKinley tariff's impact on prices. Newspapers of the era called tariffs the Great American Question, proof that economic walls could decide the fate of presidents. The debates often carried a tone that feels eerily familiar today. Advocates of high tariffs claimed they defended American workers, echoing arguments we still hear in 2025 about shielding domestic industries from global competition. Opponents countered that tariffs enriched corporations while raising costs for ordinary people, a complaint not so different from modern concerns about inflation and inequality. The Gilded Age, for all its steam engines and coal smoke, offers a mirror to our own age of microchips and digital trade. What made the issue so volatile was not simply economics, but identity. To industrialists and urban workers in the North, protection was patriotism, proof that America could stand on its own. To farmers and traders in the South and West, tariffs were symbols of exploitation, evidence that the federal government served distant elites. The divide was not merely about numbers on ledgers. It was about whose America would triumph. By the dawn of the 20th century, the tariff question remained unresolved. It would continue to shape elections, policies, and alliances, laying the groundwork for the even greater storms of the Great Depression. But in the 1870s through the 1890s, tariffs stood at the center of American life, beloved by some, despised by others. Always potent enough to sway the course of politics. Picture for a moment the crowded floor of Congress in 1890. Lawmakers debate with fiery passion. Lobbyists whisper in the shadows. Newspapers thunder with headlines, and beyond the chamber walls, millions of ordinary Americans wait to learn whether their goods will cost more, whether their crops will sell abroad, whether their voices will matter. It is a scene that reminds us how tariffs, more than mere fiscal tools, have always been battlegrounds of power and identity. And if you are still with me, still awake as we leave behind the Gilded Age and march toward the storms of the 20th century, leave a 1 in the comments below. Your quiet signal tells me these echoes of history continue to reach across the years. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the United States stood transformed. Smokestacks lined the skylines of Pittsburgh and Chicago. Railroads stitched together plains and mountains, and America's factories rivaled those of Britain and Germany. Yet the engine of this prosperity still ran on an old debate: tariffs. Were they the shield that allowed American industry to flourish, or the invisible weight that burdened farmers and consumers? The Republican Party, heirs of Lincoln's legacy, made their position clear. High tariffs, they declared, were the foundation of American greatness. William McKinley, the Ohio congressman, who had championed the tariff that bore his name in 1890, ascended to the presidency in 1897, promising prosperity through protection. His successor, Theodore Roosevelt, though better remembered for trust-busting in national parks, likewise defended tariffs as tools to secure industry and labor alike. The Dingley Tariff of 1897, followed by the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909, set some of the highest rates in U.S. history. Duties on wool, steel, textiles, and sugar reassured manufacturers that they would not be undercut by European competition. Advocates pointed to the results. American steel production soared, exports expanded, and workers in urban centers enjoyed rising wages. The United States was no longer a fledgling republic struggling for revenue. It was an industrial giant, and tariffs seemed to prove their worth as guardians of prosperity. But not everyone saw it that way. Farmers across the Midwest and South felt crushed beneath the system. Their crops, wheat, corn, cotton, were sold in global markets. Yet they were forced to buy tools, clothing, and household goods at inflated prices behind tariff walls. The discontent fueled the rise of the populist movement, whose leaders denounced tariffs as the robber's toll. William Jennings Bryan, in his fiery speeches, attacked the Republican establishment for protecting industrial monopolies at the expense of the common man. The tariff also split the Republican Party itself. President Taft, who signed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, faced backlash from progressives who believed he had betrayed reform. The fight over duties became a wedge issue, weakening the GOP and paving the way for Woodrow Wilson's victory in 1912. Wilson, a Democrat, ran on a platform of tariff reform, arguing that America's future lay in freer trade. His Underwood Tariff of 1913 slashed rates dramatically, marking the first significant move toward lower duties in decades. Yet even this reform revealed the nation's dependence. The lost revenue had to be replaced, and thus the 16th Amendment's introduction of a federal income tax filled the gap. In this sense, tariffs had shaped not only the economy, but the very structure of American governance. The industrial age tariffs remind us that walls, built to protect, can also divide. For factory workers in Pittsburgh, high duties meant security. For wheat farmers in Kansas, they meant hardship. The political battles of the early 1900s carried echoes of the nullification crisis, the Gilded Age clashes, and even the sectional tensions of the Civil War. Tariffs were never just economics, they were identity, dividing the nation into winners and losers. The echo to our time is sharp. In 2025, as debates swirl over tariffs on technology and agriculture, the same questions remain. Can duties protect American jobs without punishing American consumers? Can they shield industries without provoking retaliation abroad? Just as McKinley promised prosperity through protection, modern leaders promise stability through tariffs. But just as in 1913, the reality proves complex. What benefits one sector may burden another, and revenue raised in one place must be balanced by costs elsewhere. Imagine, then, an American port around 1905. Ships unload cargo under the watchful eye of customs officials. Crates of German steel tools are taxed before they can reach American markets. British textiles are tallied and levied, their price rising before they ever touch a shop counter. In the same port, American wheat waits to be exported, its price vulnerable to retaliatory tariffs abroad. The scene is alive with industry. But beneath the surface runs a question as old as the Republic: whose prosperity is being protected, and at what price? And so, as the United States stepped into the 20th century, tariffs remained both foundation and fault line. They promised protection, delivered prosperity to some, but reminded many others that economic walls, once raised, cast long shadows. When the guns of August thundered in 1914, tariffs suddenly seemed less important than trenches and shells. Yet behind the front lines, they still mattered, shaping how nations financed war and how they sought to rebuild peace. World War I consumed not only lives but resources, and the need to protect domestic industries grew sharper than ever. For the United States, neutrality in the early years meant opportunity. American factories sold steel, munitions, and food to both sides. Tariffs keeping out foreign competition and ensuring domestic producers thrived. By 1917, when America entered the war, customs duties were only part of the financial picture income. Taxes, newly established by the 16th Amendment, now played a larger role, but tariffs still signaled protection. Imports of manufactured goods from Europe collapsed during the conflict, and U.S. industries flourished behind protective walls. When the war ended in 1918, the challenge was how to rebuild a shattered world economy. Europe was in ruins, its trade networks broken, its treasuries empty. Many leaders spoke of freer trade as the path to recovery, but in practice the opposite occurred. Nations raised tariffs to protect fragile industries, fearful of being overwhelmed by foreign competition. In a moment of weakness, the United States, flush with victory and prosperity, led the way. The Emergency Tariff Act of 1921 raised duties on agricultural imports, a direct response to American farmers who feared being undercut by European grain. This was followed by the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922, which raised average duties to nearly 40%. Proponents claimed these measures preserved American prosperity, protecting both industry and agriculture from the turbulence abroad. The rhetoric was triumphant. America had become the world's economic giant, and high tariffs would keep it secure. But beneath the optimism, cracks spread. European nations, desperate to sell goods, to pay their war debts, found American markets closed. Germany, struggling under the weight of reparations, resented barriers that cut off its exports. Historians like Charles Kindleberger have argued that U.S. tariff policy in the 1920s undermined global recovery, making it harder for Europe to stabilize and fueling tensions that never fully healed. The glittering decade of jazz and skyscrapers in America masked a fragile world order, one where economic walls deepened resentment rather than eased it. Domestically, tariffs shaped politics once more. Farmers initially welcomed protection, but soon realized that duties on imports did little to address their deeper problems: falling prices, surpluses, and mounting debts. By the late 1920s, agricultural distress was severe, yet tariffs remained high. When the Great Depression struck after 1929, these protective walls would trap the global economy in collapse. But that is a later chapter. For now, in the 1920s, the tariff stood as a symbol of American confidence. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover all defended protectionism, portraying it as a guarantee of prosperity. Newspapers celebrated the rise of American industry, while critics warned that walls built too high would isolate the nation. The debate mirrored earlier centuries, but on a global scale, one nation's shield was another nation's wound. The echo to our own age is clear. In 2025, America again faces a fragile global order. Wars abroad, shifting alliances, and economic uncertainty fuel calls for tariffs as instruments of protection. Politicians declare they will defend jobs and industries, just as they did a century ago. Yet history warns us: walls raised in moments of strength can sow seeds of future weakness. The Ford-New Macumber tariff was celebrated as prosperity's guardian, but it helped create the imbalances that shattered the world in the 1930s. Picture, if you will, the docks of New York in 1922. Ships arrived from Europe, their cargoes met, not with eager merchants but with customs officials wielding new tariff schedules. Crates of French wine, German tools, and Italian cloth sit longer in warehouses, their prices raised beyond the reach of many buyers. In the offices above, American businessmen smile at the protection, while across the Atlantic, European traders shake their heads in despair. Prosperity gleams in Manhattan's skyscrapers, but across the ocean, resentment deepens. And so, the post-war years remind us that tariffs are not only national policy, they are international signals. They speak to allies and rivals alike, declaring whether a nation sees the world as partner or threat. In the 1920s, America chose walls, and the world trembled. The crash of 1929 began as a storm on Wall Street, but within months its tremors reached every farm, factory, and household in America. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and the optimism of the 1920s dissolved into fear. In such a climate, the old reflex returned. Tariffs, once again, were called upon as the shield of a troubled nation. What emerged was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, one of the most infamous pieces of legislation in U.S. history. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis C. Hawley of Oregon argued that raising duties on foreign goods would protect American farmers and manufacturers from the collapse of world markets. Their bill increased tariffs on over 20,000 imported products, pushing rates to an average of nearly 60%, the highest in the nation's history. Advocates promised it would preserve jobs, stabilize prices, and restore prosperity. But the logic of protection, once again, carried hidden risks. The reaction abroad was swift and bitter. Canada, America's largest trading partner, retaliated almost immediately with duties on U.S. goods. European nations, already reeling from war debts and economic distress, saw the tariff as a declaration of hostility. Within 2 years, world trade collapsed by nearly 2/3. Exports that might have provided relief for American farmers dried up, leaving crops to rot in silos. Factories that once sold goods overseas shuttered their doors. What had been designed as a shield became, in practice, a prison. Contemporary voices recognized the disaster even as it unfolded. More than 1,000 economists signed petitions urging President Herbert Hoover to veto the bill, warning that it would deepen the crisis rather than cure it. But Hoover, caught between pressure from Congress and desperation for solutions, signed it into law. The New York Times lamented that tariffs had turned from a tool of policy into a wall of fear, isolating America just when cooperation was most needed. The Smoot-Hawley tariff did not cause the Great Depression, but it worsened it. By severing global trade, it amplified unemployment, sharpened deflation, and fueled resentment abroad. Historians such as Charles Kindleberger later argued that the tariff helped destabilize the fragile international order, weakening democracies and strengthening radical movements. The seeds of World War II, in part, found nourishment in the soil of economic despair worsened by tariff walls. The parallels to our time are sobering. In 2025, debates rage about tariffs on technology, energy, and food. Advocates insist they protect jobs, shield industries, and defend national security. Yet history whispers a warning. Protection can quickly become isolation, and isolation can magnify crisis. Just as in 1930, when the world needed cooperation but received walls instead. Our own age risks repeating the cycle if fear outweighs foresight. Imagine America in 1931. Bread lines stretching across city blocks, farmers watching unsold crops rot, factory whistles silent. In the midst of this, warehouses filled with goods that could not be sold abroad because tariff barriers had closed every market. The very policy meant to save American livelihoods had made them harder to sustain. It is an image both haunting and instructive, a reminder that economic walls can cast shadows longer than any skyscraper. And so, the story of Smoot-Hawley is not simply about one law. It is about the danger of mistaking walls for solutions. In moments of fear, nations reach for tariffs as shields. But history shows that shields can become cages. And cages can trap even the strongest of nations. The Smoot-Hawley tariff had built a wall, and the world responded by building its own. By the mid-1930s, trade was no longer the bridge between nations it had been in the gilded days of the 1920s. It had become another battlefield, quieter than the trenches of World War I, but no less destructive. Each country, desperate to shield itself from the storm of the Great Depression, raised tariffs, imposed quotas, and tightened currency controls. Instead of cooperation, the world chose economic nationalism, and the cracks in the fragile global order deepened. Britain, abandoning its old faith in free trade, turned inward. At the 1932 Ottawa Conference, London forged the system of imperial preference, granting tariff advantages to goods from within the British Empire, while shutting out rivals. Wheat from Canada, wool from Australia, and tea from India received favorable treatment, while American and European products faced steep duties. What had once been a global marketplace shrank into exclusive blocks. Germany, under Hitler, turned tariffs and trade policy into tools of ideology. The Nazi regime rejected global markets in favor of autarky, economic self-sufficiency. Tariffs, quotas, and state-controlled trade agreements became weapons to prepare for war. Germany bartered with Eastern Europe, exchanging manufactured goods for raw materials, circumventing the free flows of commerce. The rhetoric was familiar: protection, independence, strength. But beneath it lay the hunger for conquest. And tariffs were simply the economic dress for territorial ambition. Japan followed a similar path, facing U.S. tariffs on silk and restrictions on other exports. Tokyo pursued expansion in Asia to secure resources beyond the reach of hostile markets. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the later push into China were justified partly as quests for economic independence. If foreign tariffs closed markets, Japan would carve out its own. The link between trade wars and shooting wars grew clearer. With each year, the United States, for its part, began to recognize the cost of isolation. Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration sought to undo some of the damage of Secretary of State Cordell Hull championed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, which allowed the president to negotiate tariff reductions with other nations. Hull believed passionately that if goods don't cross borders, armies will. The law marked the first tentative step toward freer trade. But it came against a backdrop of rising authoritarianism abroad. Despite these efforts, the 1930s remained dominated by suspicion. International trade never recovered to pre-1929 levels. Economic blocs hardened political divisions, fueling the grievances that erupted in World War II. Historians often point to militarism, ideology, and diplomacy as causes of the conflict, but economics played its part too. Tariffs, trade wars, and the collapse of global cooperation ensured that when war came in 1939, it fell upon a world already divided by walls. The resonance with 2025 is uncomfortable. Once again, nations speak of decoupling, of strategic independence, of protecting supply chains at any cost. Tariffs on semiconductors, green energy technology, and agriculture are justified as national defense. Yet history warns us when countries build walls in fear, they may inadvertently build the foundations of conflict. Economic blocs can become political blocs, and political blocs can drift toward confrontation. Imagine, for a moment, the world of 1937. In London, ministers debate tariffs that bind the empire closer together. In Berlin, Nazi officials sign trade agreements that bind Eastern Europe into dependence. In Washington, Cordell Hull quietly negotiates reciprocal treaties, swimming against the tide of nationalism. And across the Pacific, Japanese ships sail not only with goods but with armies, seeking resources denied them by foreign barriers. The air is heavy with unease, a sense that tariffs and duties, once dry economic tools, have become signals of hostility. The interwar years remind us that economic policy is never neutral. Tariffs may be written in ledgers, but they are read in the language of power. When raised too high, they cease to be shields and become declarations. By the late 1930s, the world had run out of patience with declarations. The guns of war would soon replace the pens of customs officers. When war erupted again in 1939, tariffs faded from the headlines, but not from the story. They were not the loud cannons of the battlefield, yet they shaped the strategies that decided the course of World War II and the world that followed. The United States, still officially neutral in the early years, used trade policy as a weapon. Even before Pearl Harbor, Washington wielded export controls and embargoes to pressure aggressor states. Japan, heavily dependent on imported oil, rubber, and steel, found its access restricted by American measures. These were not called tariffs, but the principle was the same: economic leverage as an instrument of national defense. By 1941, when the U.S. froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports entirely, Tokyo's leaders felt cornered. The bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor were, in part, responses to trade walls. Once the U.S. entered the war, its trade policy shifted again. Rather than raising protective tariffs, the Roosevelt administration embraced controlled openness with allies. Under the Lend-Lease program, Washington supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and China with weapons, food and raw materials, not for coin but for partnership. Tariffs mattered less than coordination. Customs houses still worked, but the greater machinery of trade became political, strategic, and global. Meanwhile, Axis powers pursued their own visions of economic order. Hitler dreamed of an autarkic Europe, bound into his Grossraumwirtschaft, a great economic space dominated by German industry. Tariffs and quotas were imposed not through law, but through conquest, as occupied nations were forced to serve the needs of the Reich. Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere carried similar ambitions, cloaking resource extraction under the guise of regional unity. In both cases, trade policy became indistinguishable from imperial domination by 1944. As Allied victory loomed, a new vision of trade emerged. Leaders recognized that tariffs and protectionism had contributed to the failures of the interwar years. At Bretton Woods, representatives from 44 nations gathered to design a post-war order where trade would be freer, currencies more stable, and cooperation institutionalized. The groundwork for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) was laid, signaling a turn away from the high walls of the 1930s toward a world where tariffs would be managed, reduced and balanced by international negotiation. For the United States, this was a conscious choice. Having seen how Smoot-Hawley and retaliatory duties deepened depression and division, policymakers concluded that prosperity required openness. Tariffs would not disappear. They remained vital tools, but they would no longer dominate economic strategy as they once had. Instead, America positioned itself as the leader of a system where trade was a weapon not of exclusion, but of partnership. The lesson resonates today. In 2025, as Washington debates tariffs on technology and supply chains, the same question returns. Will the U.S. choose walls or bridges? History shows both paths. The walls of Smoot-Hawley fed crisis. The bridges of Bretton Woods helped build decades of growth. The stakes may be different now: microchips instead of wheat, data instead of steel. But the logic remains. Protection can defend, but only cooperation can sustain. Picture the world in 1945. New York's harbors, crowded with ships unloading cargo for the war effort. While in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, economists and diplomats argue over exchange rates and tariffs. Soldiers carry rifles across Europe and the Pacific, while in quiet rooms, policymakers carry ledgers, determined that when the guns fall silent, the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. Out of that tension, a new order was born, one that would shape the second half of the 20th century. And so the story of tariffs in World War II is not just about duties or embargoes. It is about the transformation of economic policy from walls of exclusion to pillars of cooperation. The guns may have spoken louder, but the ledgers whispered the terms of peace. If you're still here with me, drifting through the echoes of wartime trade and the fragile birth of a new order, leave a 1 in the comments below. It tells me you are still awake, still listening, and still carrying the lessons of history into our restless present. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but the economic battles that followed were quieter only in sound, not in consequence. The United States emerged from the war not only as a military giant, but also as the architect of a new global order. Tariffs, which had once fueled rivalries and depression, were now reimagined as tools of balance. Instead of endless escalation, the post-war world sought coordination, at least among allies. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, signed in 1947, embodied this new spirit. Its aim was simple in theory but revolutionary in practice. Reduce tariffs gradually, encourage freer trade, and prevent a return to the beggar-the-neighbor policies of the 1930s. Under American leadership, nations agreed to sit at the same table, negotiate concessions, and replace unilateral barriers with collective compromise. The vision was that trade, once a cause of division, could become a foundation for peace. Yet the story was never that smooth. Even as GATT lowered barriers, nations clung to their protective instincts. The United States itself maintained tariffs on sensitive goods, agriculture, textiles, and certain industrial products. European countries, rebuilding from ruin, shielded key industries with duties and quotas, arguing that without protection their economies would collapse. Japan, rising from the ashes, pursued a strategy of guarded openness, exporting aggressively, while carefully managing imports. The Cold War gave tariffs another meaning. Economic policy was not only about prosperity, but about ideology. Washington urged freer trade among capitalist allies, framing it as proof of the strength of democracy. The Soviet bloc, by contrast, retreated behind rigid controls, creating a closed system of exchange. Tariffs and quotas became symbolic borders, dividing not just markets but worlds. At home, American politics still wrestled with the old questions. In the 1950s and 1960s, debates raged over whether tariffs truly served the American worker. Some industries like steel and automobiles pressed for protection against European and Japanese imports. Labor unions joined the chorus, warning that free trade endangered jobs. Others, however, argued that tariffs only raised prices and stifled innovation. President John F. Kennedy, in his 1962 Trade Expansion Act, sought to navigate this tension, authorizing tariff cuts that paved the way for the Kennedy round of GATT negotiations. The law reflected both confidence and anxiety. Confidence in America's industrial might, and anxiety that without cooperation, rivals might outpace it. Meanwhile, the developing world experienced tariffs differently. Newly independent nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America often embraced protectionism, seeing tariffs as shields to nurture infant industries. The language echoed Hamilton's report on manufactures, but the stage was global. Leaders from India to Brazil insisted that free trade was a luxury of the strong. The weak needed walls until they could stand tall. In this way, tariffs became part of the great conversation of decolonization, where economic sovereignty was as prized as political independence. The parallels to our time are striking. In 2025, America debates tariffs on high-tech goods, electric vehicles, and agriculture with the same mixture of hope and fear. Advocates insist protection will preserve jobs. Critics warn it may isolate the nation. The post-war world reminds us that neither vision is entirely wrong. Tariffs can nurture strength, but they can also provoke resentment. What matters is balanza. Lesson easier to preach than to practice. Imagine, for a moment, the halls of Geneva in 1964 during a GATT negotiation. Diplomats from dozens of nations sit at long tables, their briefcases filled with tariff schedules. Translators whisper, scribes record, and deals are struck not with cannons but with compromises. Each concession is small, measured in percentages and product codes, but together they form the fragile scaffolding of peace. Outside, the Cold War looms, Berlin divided, missiles bristling in Cuba, yet here, at least, nations test the idea that commerce can tame conflict. The Cold War years proved that tariffs, once sparks of revolution and war, could be harnessed as instruments of stability. But they also proved how fragile that balance remained, forever threatened by the tension between national protection and global cooperation. The optimism of the post-war boom could not last forever. By the early 1970s, the United States and much of the Western world faced a challenge unlike any they had known before. Stagflation, the bitter combination of stagnant growth and rising prices. At the heart of this crisis stood oil, the lifeblood of modern economies. And as fuel costs soared, so too did the familiar call for tariffs, quotas, and walls of protection. In 1973, the Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Tankers slowed. Gas stations in America ran dry, and lines of cars stretched for blocks as drivers waited hours to buy a few gallons. Inflation surged while unemployment rose, a cruel paradox that baffled economists. The post-war system of prosperity had cracked, and panic spread through boardrooms and kitchen tables alike. In Washington, voices rose demanding protection for struggling industries. The U.S. steel industry, once dominant, now faced fierce competition from Japan and Western Europe. Labor unions pleaded for tariffs to keep jobs from vanishing overseas. Automakers, under siege from efficient Japanese cars, asked for quotas and restrictions. Politicians, wary of voter anger in a time of inflation, offered sympathetic ears. The same nation that had championed freer trade through GATT now flirted once more with protectionism. Congress responded with a patchwork of measures. Tariffs were adjusted, quotas imposed, and voluntary export restraints negotiated with Japan and Europe. The Trade Act of 1974 gave the president broad powers to retaliate against unfair foreign trade practices, a sign that economic nationalism was creeping back into policy. While these measures offered temporary relief to industries in crisis, they did little to solve the underlying malaise. Prices kept rising, jobs kept shrinking, and public trust in leadership eroded. Globally, the 1970s became a decade of fractured trade. Nations scrambled to shield their economies from volatility. Britain wrestled with inflation and strikes, raising barriers even as it entered the European Economic Community. Developing nations, burdened by debt and rising oil costs, sought to protect their markets with tariffs of their own. The fragile promise of freer trade seemed to falter, replaced by a defensive crouch. Historians later looked back at this period as a reminder of how easily prosperity can slip into fear. The oil shocks revealed that no tariff could shield a nation from global forces beyond its control. America could raise duties on steel or textiles, but it could not tariff its way out of dependence on imported oil. Protection might ease political pressure, but it could not fill gas tanks. The echoes in 2025 are difficult to miss. Once again, the United States faces the unease of inflation mixed with uncertainty. Energy markets are strained by war and climate transitions. Industries plead for protection, and tariffs are invoked as shields against rivals. Yet history whispers caution. The 1970s proved that tariffs may soothe symptoms but rarely cure the disease. They can protect jobs for a season, but they cannot reverse deeper imbalances. Picture an American street in 1974. A long line of cars coils around a gas station, drivers leaning on their steering wheels in frustration. Newspapers speak of energy crisis, while in Congress, lawmakers debate duties on imported steel. The people in line do not care about tariff schedules. They care about the price of fuel, the shrinking value of their wages, the fear that tomorrow will be harder than today. It was in such moments that protectionism gained political power, because it solved problems, but because it offered the promise of control. The lesson is stark. Tariffs can buy time, but they cannot buy energy, trust, or growth. In the 1970s, the United States learned that walls built in fear often crumble when the ground beneath them shifts, and in our own time, as leaders debate new duties and restrictions, we would do well to remember that stagflation cannot be fought with tariffs alone. If you are still awake, still following the long shadows of oil shocks and tariff battles, leave A1 in the comments below. It tells me the story still carries you, even through the uneasy nights of history. The 1980s opened with a paradox. Ronald Reagan swept into office in 1981, proclaiming his faith in free markets and freer trade, promising to roll back government interference. Yet even as his administration preached liberalization, it presided over some of the most significant protectionist measures since the Great Depression. Tariffs, it seemed, were like old ghosts. No matter how often declared, banished, they returned when fear reigned. The source of that fear was Japan. By the early 1980s, Japanese industries, especially automobiles, steel, and electronics, were outcompeting their American counterparts. Toyota and Honda cars, known for fuel efficiency and reliability, flooded U.S. roads just as Detroit struggled with declining quality and rising costs. Japanese electronics firms like Sony and Toshiba seized market share in televisions, semiconductors, and memory chips. To many Americans, it felt as if Japan was not just a competitor, but a conqueror, capturing industries that had once defined U.S. might. The backlash was fierce. Congress demanded protection for U.S. industries, and Reagan, despite his rhetoric, agreed. In 1981, his administration negotiated voluntary export restraints with Japan, limiting the number of cars Japanese firms could sell in the United States. Tariffs were avoided in name, but the effect was the same: a wall built to shield Detroit. Similar measures targeted steel and semiconductors. The 1984 Trade and Tariff Act strengthened the government's power to retaliate against what it deemed unfair trade practices. Protection had returned under a new banner. The irony was not lost on observers. Reagan, the champion of free enterprise, found himself presiding over a surge of managed trade. Historians like Douglas Irwin, later, noted that Reagan's policies revealed a deep truth: free trade is rarely absolute. It bends when political pressure mounts. American workers in steel towns and auto plants demanded action, and the president responded, even if it meant contradicting his own ideals. The measures did buy time. Detroit regained some footing, steel producers stabilized, and the semiconductor industry received government support. But they also carried costs. Consumers paid higher prices for cars and electronics, and tensions with Japan escalated. Japanese firms responded by investing directly in the U.S., building factories in Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. The walls built to keep them out, instead, invited them in, transforming the industrial map of America. This strange dance of protection and openness reflected the broader contradictions of the 1980s. On the one hand, Reagan championed the creation of global trade agreements, pushing forward the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations that would eventually lead to the World Trade Organization in the 1990s. On the other hand, his administration leaned heavily on tariffs, quotas, and restraints to calm domestic fears. America wanted both to lead the global march toward freer trade and to shield its own industries from the pains of competition. The resonance with 2025 is immediate. Today, debates over tariffs on Chinese technology, European steel, or Mexican agriculture echo the same anxieties that once swirled around Japan. Advocates insist that protection preserves jobs. Critics argue that it raises costs and risks trade wars. Just as Reagan discovered, even the loudest champions of free markets bow to the political reality that industries in distress demand walls. Imagine an American auto plant in Detroit in 1982. Workers gather anxiously in break rooms, hearing that Japanese cars are outselling theirs 2-1. Newspapers carry headlines about plant closures, while in Washington, officials hammer out voluntary limits on imports. A sigh of relief spreads across the shop floor when the news arrives. Fewer Japanese cars will enter next year. But in Tokyo, executives are already planning new factories inside America, sidestepping the very walls meant to exclude them. The tariff war had become a negotiation not of exclusion but of adaptation. The lesson of the Reagan era is subtle but sharp. Tariffs and trade barriers can buy time, but they rarely stop change. Japan's rise forced America to innovate, to compete, and eventually to integrate. The walls slowed the tide, but the tide still came. And so, as America, in 2025, debates tariffs on semiconductors, electric vehicles, and solar panels, the echoes of the 1980s return. The rival may have changed from Tokyo to Beijing, but the script remains. Fear of decline, demands for protection, promises of prosperity. History suggests the outcome will be less about walls and more about how nations adapt when those walls inevitably bend. The Cold War ended, not with cannon fire, but but with open markets. In the 1990s, globalization became the new faith of policymakers. Tariffs, once the defining battleground of American politics, seemed destined to fade into history. Leaders in Washington and across the world declared that freer trade would secure prosperity, peace, and even democracy. The tools of protection were not discarded, but they were increasingly seen as relics of a more fearful age. The creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995 symbolized this shift. Building on decades of GATT negotiations, the WTO provided a permanent framework for resolving disputes and reducing tariffs. Countries committed to lowering barriers, and for a time, it seemed to work. Average global tariff rates dropped dramatically, and trade flows surged. The Washington Consensus preached the virtues of open markets, privatization, and deregulation. American presidents from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush embraced the rhetoric, assuring voters that globalization was the tide that would lift all boats. Yet beneath the optimism, tensions lingered. Not all boats rose equally. American factories in steel, textiles, and electronics struggled against low-cost imports from Asia and Latin America. Communities that had once thrived on manufacturing saw jobs vanish, plants shutter, and wages stagnate. Tariffs, once dismissed as outdated, began to resurface in the political imagination, not as solutions yet, but as symbols of what had been lost. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, signed in 1994, embodied both the promise and peril of this era. Proponents argued that removing tariffs between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico would create efficiency and growth. Critics warned that it would send American jobs south of the border. Both were right. Trade volumes soared, but so did dislocation. In certain industries, the battles over NAFTA in Congress revealed that even in an age of globalization, tariffs and trade policy could ignite fierce passions. The late 1990s and early 2000s brought new disputes. The U.S. imposed safeguard tariffs on steel in 2002 under President George W. Bush, sparking retaliation from the European Union. The WTO ruled against the U.S., forcing the duties to be lifted. Similar clashes arose over textiles, agriculture, and technology. Globalization had not erased tariffs. It had simply relocated the fight to new arenas, from national legislatures to international tribunals. China's rise added fuel to the fire. Its entry into the WTO in 2001 was hailed as a milestone, promising integration into the global order. But within a few years, American industries complained of unfair competition, subsidies, and surging imports. Calls for tariffs grew louder once again, this time not against Japan or Europe, but against a new giant in the East. The optimism of globalization gave way to unease, as the very system designed to reduce barriers seemed to expose America's vulnerabilities. Historians and economists often look back at this period as the high-water mark of globalization. Ports bustled, supply chains lengthened, and tariffs dropped to historic lows. Yet politically, the seeds of backlash were already planted. Workers in the Midwest, towns hollowed out by factory closures, began to question whether free trade truly served them. Politicians found that invoking tariffs as symbols of protection resonated deeply, even if policy remained tied to globalization. The echo to our time is unmistakable. In 2025, debates over tariffs on Chinese technology or European agriculture feel like extensions of the disputes born in the 1990s and 2000s. The WTO still exists, but its authority is challenged. Globalization, once unquestioned, is now debated with suspicion, and tariffs, once seen as relics, have returned to the center of political discourse. Picture the streets of Seattle in 1999. During the WTO Ministerial Conference, protesters clash, with police chanting against globalization, carrying signs, denouncing trade agreements that they believed sacrificed workers and the environment. Inside the halls, officials debate tariff schedules in dry, technical language. Outside, the air is filled with tear gas and the sound of drums. It was a moment when the optimism of open markets collided with the realities of inequality, a reminder that trade policy is never merely about goods. It is about people. The 1990s and 2000s remind us that even in the age of globalization, tariffs never disappeared. They changed form, they shifted stage, but they remained powerful symbols. To some, they represented obstacles torn down in the march toward prosperity. To others, they represented lost protections, abandoned in the name of global efficiency. The debate was never settled. It simply waited for the next crisis to bring it roaring back. The 21st century began with a paradox of its own. On the one hand, globalization seemed triumphant. Supply chains stretched across continents. Goods flowed faster than ever, and the digital revolution made borders feel less relevant. On the other hand, discontent brewed. Communities hollowed out by offshoring, industries displaced by cheaper imports, and rising inequality created fertile ground for a return to the oldest weapon in economic policy. Tariffs, at the center of this new drama stood China. Its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 promised a smooth integration into the rules-based global order. Instead, it triggered one of the most significant economic shifts in modern history. Factories in the American Midwest shuttered as production moved east, and a flood of Chinese imports textiles, electronics, steel, and later solar panels and semiconductors reshaped entire sectors. Economists dubbed the phenomenon the China shock, estimating that millions of US manufacturing jobs were lost in the first decade of the new century. For a time, policymakers resisted protectionist calls. Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama pursued free trade agreements like CAFTA and the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership. Yet beneath the speeches about open markets, pressure mounted. American steel producers lobbied for protection, unions demanded action, and local politicians warned that patience was running out. The turning point came in 2018, under President Donald Trump, declaring that trade wars are good and easy to win. His administration imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports, covering everything from machinery to clothing. China retaliated with duties on American soybeans, pork, and other agricultural products, hitting the heartland hard. The result was not victory, but escalation. Higher prices for consumers, strained supply chains, and uncertainty for businesses. Farmers relied on government bailouts to survive lost exports, while manufacturers scrambled to adapt. The trade war revealed an uncomfortable truth in a world of interwoven supply chains. Tariffs cut both ways. U.S. companies that imported parts from China found their own costs rising. Consumers noticed prices creeping upward, from electronics to washing machines. Allies caught in the crossfire questioned America's leadership. And yet, the politics of protection resonated. Tariffs became not only economic tools, but symbols of national sovereignty, echoing the debates of 1828, 1890, and 1930. The COVID-19 pandemic deepened the story. Supply chain disruptions exposed America's dependence on foreign production for critical goods, from masks to microchips. Calls for reshoring and decoupling grew louder, and tariffs were defended as tools of resilience. Even as administrations changed, the measures remained. President Joe Biden maintained many of Trump's tariffs, reframing them as part of a broader strategy of competition with China. By the mid-2020s, tariffs had become central to debates about national security. Duties on semiconductors, solar technology, and electric vehicles were justified not merely as protection, but as survival in a world of geopolitical rivalry. The rhetoric sounded eerily familiar, just as Rome taxed provinces to fund armies, Just as Napoleon closed ports to strangle Britain, so too modern states wield tariffs as weapons in their great power contests. The echo for 2025 is sharp. America stands at a crossroads, torn between the promise of open markets and the fear of dependence on rivals. Politicians speak of defending workers, industries, and security through tariffs, while critics warn of higher costs, retaliation, and fractured alliances. The debate is no longer academic. It reaches dinner tables, gas stations, and factories, as it has for centuries. Picture for a moment a ship docking at Los Angeles in 2025. Its containers carry semiconductors, solar panels, and electric batteries. Customs officials review lists, calculating duties imposed not only to raise revenue, but to send a message that America will not cede its future to rivals. On the other side of the Pacific, Chinese ports adjust their own levies, preparing the next move in a game as old as empire. The ledger, once again, has become a battlefield. And so, the story of tariffs carries us into the present. From Roman harbors to Boston tea, from Napoleonic blockades to the WTO, the rhythm is the same. Walls raised, promises made, costs borne, and lessons often ignored. In 2025, as leaders debate tariffs anew, we are reminded that history does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes, again and again, like the toll of a bell across centuries. If you're still with me, still awake, as we arrive at this final frontier of trade wars and modern uncertainty, leave a 1 in the comments below. It lets me know the echoes of history are still alive for you tonight. We have traveled a long road tonight, one paved not with stones but with tariffs, tolls, and taxes that echo across centuries. From the docks of ancient Rome, where merchants whispered bribes to scribes, to the salt roads of medieval France, where peasants smuggled handfuls of crystals beneath their cloaks, to the harbors of Boston, where colonists cast crates of tea into the sea. Our story has been less about economics than about human nature. Tariffs are never merely numbers on a page. They are expressions of fear and ambition, of rivalry and survival, of rulers promising protection and subjects counting the cost. What, then, have we seen? Rome's tariffs filled imperial coffers, yet they corroded trust between center and provinces. Medieval kings imposed duties on salt, wool, and wine, securing their wars but kindling rebellions that toppled dynasties. The young United States, born in protest against duties imposed from afar, turned to tariffs as its lifeblood, only to find them sparking sectional crises that nearly tore the nation apart. The industrial giants of the Gilded Age built fortunes behind protective walls, while farmers cursed those same walls as prisons. In the 20th century, tariffs played their tragic role in deepening depression and paving the way to war. Before being reimagined at Bretton Woods as part of a more hopeful vision of cooperation, and yet, through all of this, the rhythm is unmistakable. In times of fear, nations raise tariffs. In times of confidence, they lower them. The cycle repeats like the turning of seasons, each generation convinced that its choices are new, when in truth they are only variations of an old song. The Romans believed their empire eternal, yet their tariffs bred unrest. Napoleon believed his continental system would cripple Britain, yet it weakened his own rule. America believed Smoot-Hawley would shield farmers and workers, yet it deepened their despair. And in our own time, we believe tariffs will protect us from rivals, forgetting how often they have punished those they meant to save. But let us not end with cynicism, for history, though it warns, also offers hope. If tariffs reveal our fears, they also reveal our resilience. Smugglers who defied Roman levies, peasants who resisted the gabelle, colonists who dumped tea into Boston Harbor, remind us that human beings are not passive before walls. They adapt, resist, innovate, and endure. Tariffs may raise costs, but they cannot extinguish ingenuity. Indeed, many industries protected by tariffs eventually grew strong enough to thrive in open competition. The cycle is not only of failure, but of transformation. In 2025, America finds itself again at a crossroads. Leaders debate duties on semiconductors, green energy, and steel. Rivals retaliate, allies grumble, consumers worry. The questions feel urgent, but they are not new. The choice is the same as it has always been: to build walls of fear or bridges of cooperation. Neither path is without risk, but history suggests that bridges, though harder to build, endure longer than walls. Consider the post-war years, when nations scarred by depression and war chose to negotiate instead of isolate. Out of Bretton Woods came a system that, despite its flaws, sustained decades of prosperity. Trade did not erase conflict, but it softened its edges. Tariffs did not vanish, but they were managed, balanced, and often lowered. The result was not utopia, but it was stability, a rare and precious thing. That lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1947, and perhaps that is the true gift of history, not answers, but perspective. When we see that our present debates echo the struggles of Rome, France, Britain, and America's own past, we understand that we are not uniquely doomed. We are simply human, caught in the same patterns, capable of making the same mistakes, but also capable of learning. So as you close your eyes tonight, let the noise of headlines fade. Inflation, stagflation, tariffs, trade wars, these are real and heavy, but they are not the whole story. The deeper story is one of endurance. Nations stumble, yet survive. Walls rise, yet crumble. People adapt, resist, and imagine something better. And if history has taught us anything, it is that even in the darkest seasons, the seeds of renewal are already sown. Let us carry that thought into the present. The tariff debates of 2025 may feel exhausting, divisive, even frightening, but they are not the end of the story. They are only another chapter in the long rhythm of protection and openness, fear and hope, and just as past generations endured, so too will we. The challenge is not to escape history, but to hear its warnings and choose wisely. So, dear listener, if you have stayed with me through Rome and France, through Boston and Smoot-Hawley, through Detroit and Tokyo, and now into our own uncertain present, thank you. Your patience keeps these echoes alive. Before you drift to sleep, I leave you with a small request. If this journey has carried you, leave a like, share this story with others, and subscribe so that together we can keep exploring the hidden threads that bind past to present. And perhaps, if you are still awake, leave a 1 in the comments below, so I know you are walking this road with me. History is not a straight line, it is a circle of echoes. But in those echoes, we find not despair, but continuity, and, in continuity, hope. Good night.